Scrub Dog of Alaska by Walt Morey. 5. Fred Martin thoughtfully rubbed his jaw with a big hand as he looked at Scrub. Guess it's time to tell Smiley Jackson we've got his Scrub Dog. Scrub lifted his head from the corner in the kitchen and thumped his tail on the floor. David said quickly, "He still limps a little, Dad. Can't we wait a few days?" "Waiting will only make it harder. If Jackson sees him now, he'll want him," David protested. "Very likely. Now even Jackson can see the kind of dog he's going to become. At least you don't have to worry about him knocking Scrub in the head. He'll be too valuable." "Smiley Jackson's no good," David said harshly. "Why do we have to tell him at all? He must think Scrub's dead since he hasn't showed up around Aurora these past weeks. Why can't we keep him and say nothing? Jackson hardly ever comes this way. He threw Scrub out to die and made him into a stray. We earned him. Suppose we did keep Scrub and Jackson doesn't see him, which is highly unlikely. Eventually, somebody else will recognize the dog. The word will get back to Jackson. He's the ratty kind who'd make us all the trouble he could. Jackson and I aren't exactly friends," Fred said. "Nobody's his friend," David said, his mother's dark head turned toward her son. "There's more to it than that. Your father told you he had trouble with Jackson. Well, it was a knockdown fight, and your father gave him a good beating." She smiled with satisfaction. "Jackson called him a squaw man because I'm an Indian." "Celia!" Fred said sharply. "David's old enough now," Celia said. "He's got to know." "Why didn't you tell me before? You had to go to school in Aurora. We didn't want you to feel different from the other children until you were old enough to understand the situation." "I knew Dad had a fight," David said. "I didn't know it was Jackson. I was only about 6. I didn't pay attention to what went on with the older people." He looked at his father. "Did you give Jackson that scar?" He had that when we came. Got it in a fight with someone else. But you see what we're up against. Jackson never forgets. He'll be trying to get back at me for that beating till the day he dies." "I guess so," David said. "If you want a pet, what's wrong with Noble?" Fred asked quietly. Noble was smart and gentle, but Scrub and David had formed a bond that was stronger than dog and master. They were equals, but he couldn't explain this to his father. He said lamely, "It wouldn't be the same, Dad." Fred ruffled his hair. "I think I understand. I'm sorry there's no other way. With most anybody else, we could have worked out something. Not with Jackson." He slipped into his coat and went off across the clearing. David wandered about the kitchen, watching the clock and the trail that led to Aurora. Scrub lay in his corner and wagged his tail whenever the boy glanced his way. Celia was baking bread. She thumped the big roll of dough on the breadboard and kneaded it angrily. An hour dragged by. The bread went into baking pans, then finally into the oven. Celia began cleaning up. David sat down beside Scrub and put his arm around the dog's neck. "Dad ought to be back by now, hadn't he?" "How should I know?" she snapped. Then she turned and said gently, "Don't watch the clock, David. Minute counting makes it longer. He's only been gone an hour and 15 minutes. Scrub put his head on David's knee. The boy scratched his ears and patted him between the eyes. The first loaves came out of the oven and a delicious aroma spread through the room. Celia sliced off the hot heel, spread it with jam, and handed it to David. It was one of his favorite treats, but he couldn't eat now. He tore it into small pieces and fed them to Scrub. "You think Jackson will come back with Dad?" "He might. It wouldn't surprise me if he wanted us to keep his dog until he's completely well." Noble began to bark. David scrambled to his feet as his father came through the door. He was alone. "What took so long?" Celia asked. "He was gone. I had to wait for him." Fred shook his head angrily. "I always knew he didn't have the brains of a mosquito, but I didn't realize how dumb he really is. I told him we had his dog and what had happened to him. What do you suppose he said?" He mimicked Smiley Jackson's nasal twang. "Well, I wondered what had happened to him. Ain't seen him around in 3-4 weeks. Figured a bear might have got him or something. So he's got a busted leg, huh? And you want me to take him back? Not a chance. I culled him last winter. He ain't worth a bullet to kill him. He's your responsibility now. You get rid of him. Don't come crying to me." "Did you tell him Scrubby was practically well now?" Celia asked. "I said he was able to walk again. I couldn't have changed his mind no matter what I said. He decided Scrub was no good months ago. Jackson thinks he's the great authority." "Did you tell him the kind of dog Scrub is becoming?" David asked. His father's dark eyes twinkled. "Well, you know I couldn't do that. It would Be my opinion against his expert judgment. Scrub felt the excitement. He rose and stood beside David. Fred scratched the dog's head. I guess you've got a home at last, fella. Scrub waved his tail and barked. Fred wrinkled his nose. That fresh bread sure smells good. David was suddenly hungry. I could eat some, Mom. Celia cut a slice, spread it with jam, and handed it to him. Scrub watched the bread and licked his lips. You still hungry, Scrubby? Celia asked as she sliced off a thick piece, spread it liberally with jam, and held it out. Scrub took it daintily in his teeth and followed David outside. Hey, Fred said, that's good bread. So? Celia asked archly. So how about me? I'm as good as any dog here. Within a couple of days, neither boy nor dog were limping. In a week, they were racing pell-mell through the woods and along the riverbank. Except in the company of his father, David had never explored the country more than a mile or two from home. Now with Scrub, he was anxious to go out alone. I don't know, Celia said doubtfully. What do you think, Fred? Why not? His father answered promptly. He's got his own light rifle, and he's a pretty fair shot. The rifle will handle any game he's likely to meet. What about grizzlies, black bear, and moose? Celia asked. There are no grizzlies around here. 40 or 50 miles away, sure, but not here. There's a few blacks, but they'll be hightailing it out to get away from Scrub. Moose aren't ugly this time of year, but he can give them a wide berth. He's got a compass and knows how to use it. If he should become lost, Scrub could lead the way home. It'll toughen him up so he can help run the trap line this winter. Well, all right, Celia patted Scrub's big head. You take good care of David, Scrubby. Carrying the rifle and his lunch in a steel knapsack. In a small knapsack, David, with Scrub beside him, headed out morning after morning. The two were gone most of the day. They followed small streams to where they emptied into rivers or tumbled into deep, quiet lakes that nestled in the cups of the mountains. They hiked over rolling breadloaf hills that were crowned with thick stands of timber. They found streams so small they could easily step across them. Then again, their way might be barred by a brawling river that charged in white frost fury between rock-jawed banks. One day they lay on the shore of a lake and watched young ducks and geese trying out their new wings while skimming uncertainly across the still surface. They dropped into miniature valleys where beaver had dammed small streams to form lakes that teemed with fish and waterfowl. David lay flat on his back in the long grass of a meadow with Scrub beside him while they shared lunch and listened to the varied sounds of the earth. They heard the distant calls of a loon, the chatter of a jay. A pair of crows talked companionably in the thicket. A short distance off, a muskrat sat on top of his house, which had been built at the edge of a pond. A flight of ducks arrowed in, wind whistling in their set wings. They splashed noisily to rest in the pond. Leaves rustled in the warm breeze, and beside his ear, David heard the faint whisper of grass stems springing erect against where his careless feet had trampled them flat. The days were long and warm and pleasant. They ate lunch in the shade of a rock, on a stream bank beside a lake, or on top of a hill, with the earth spread out below them. They drank from crystal-clear streams. Once David went swimming while Scrub stood on the bank and barked with worry. Scrub continued to gain weight, but now it was ropes of muscle that spanned his shoulders and the breadth of his chest. The addition of muscle gave him a sturdy look. The youthful awkwardness was gone. He had entered into young doghood and was becoming especially quick and nimble. He could run with amazing speed. Fred said, "He's going to be quite a dog." In fact, he is. I'd guess at full maturity, he'll go close to 100 pounds. One morning, the cabin roof was white with frost. The faint breeze had a cutting edge. Leaves browned and fell whispering into the grass. The grass that had grown with such lusty vigor died overnight. Fall was suddenly upon them. The waterways emptied of ducks and geese. The great migrations formed into huge V's and went winging south. The birds' farewell calls flittered down through gathering cloud masses. The silence of approaching winter closed over the earth. The sun lost its heat. Ice formed along the banks of the river where David and Scrub had fished. Scotty did not make it back for a visit before the first snow fell. With a good snowfall covering the ground, David and Fred started out to set their more than 500 traps. David had never gone on the trap line before. He rode in the sled's basket. Scrub tottered alongside, tail curled over his back, grinning from ear to ear. They had an 80-mile circle to cover. There were 4 cabins at regular intervals where they could spend the night. Scotty's made a 5th cabin a mile off their trap line. It was slow work setting the traps the first time. It was even slower because Fred showed David how to make each set. Then he had the boy duplicate it. When you're ready, Fred explained, we'll lengthen the line, split it up, and both work it. But first, you've got to know everything I do. He asked once if David wanted to try handling the team. David said no. His father didn't ask again. The first night, Fred staked Scrub out with the other dogs. The moment David entered the cabin and closed the door, Scrub began to howl. He kept it up until David went out and brought him in. Guess I made a mistake, Fred grinned. He's a house dog and knows it. Scrub ate in the cabin with them. That night he slept on the dirt floor beside David's bunk. From then on, that was how it was. The third morning, they were hitching up the team, while Scrub sat on his tail a few feet off, watching interestedly. David said, Dad, let's put Scrub in and see what he does. Why not? He's certainly big enough and strong enough. Jack's getting a little old. We'll take him out and let him follow along. They buckled Scrub into the harness between Spot and Ginger. Scrub kept turning around trying to go back to David in the sled, but the harness stopped him. At Fred's shout, the team was off, dragging Scrub with it. He hung back, fighting to get free. He growled and snarled. Ginger promptly nipped him as a warning. Scrub whirled to tear into Ginger, and Spot took him from the other side. He was caught between the 2 dogs. The harness kept him from backing off to get them in front of him. The rest of the team kept pulling. Scrub was being hit from behind, in front, and dragged too. He was forced to turn and run. After a couple of miles of alternately trying to whirl and fight his tormentors and being dragged, he finally began to run with the team. By the end of the day, he was having little trouble. He's doing fine, Fred said. You want to leave him in? Might as well. I think he's beginning to enjoy it. Scrub stayed in harness, and he did seem to enjoy using his young strength. He was sharp and observing. He ran with his big head up, amber eyes searching out ahead, tongue lolling out in a grin. He could see Noble and observed how the lead dog skirted a dangerous path of rotting ice that Scrub felt bend beneath their weight when they came close. Noble turned out to avoid snow-covered rocks or stumps that could smash the sled. He set the pace and kept the team strung out. The team followed whatever Noble did. When the man spoke, it was always to Noble. The 5th night, they made Scotty's cabin. The following night, they would be home. I see you got rid of the crutches, Scotty said to David. Just like you said, David smiled. And look at Scrub. Scotty examined Scrub and patted his head. You turned out like I figured you would, friend. Does Smiley Jackson know where you are? He knows, David said. Dad told him, but he wouldn't even come to see Scrub. He told Dad to get rid of him. That's Smiley Jackson for you, Scotty said. Scrub had crowded into the cabin with them, and David said, Do you mind, Scotty? He always come in. He sleeps beside my bunk. Scotty shrugged. I had my whole team in the cabin sometimes. He picked up a frying pan. How's bacon pancakes strike you fellows? Fine, David and Fred chorused. Scotty looked at Scrub. How about you, friend? Scrub waved his tail and lifted his lips in a grin. They left Scotty before daylight next morning, and Scrub was still in harness, with Jack trotting alongside. They made good time, and by late afternoon were within a couple of miles of home. When they rounded a thicket and found Smiley Jackson resting his young team in the trail, Black Keno was the leader. The team was composed of some of the young dogs that had made up the pack which had harassed Scrub all winter. Noble turned to go around, and Smiley yelled, Hey, wait a minute. Fred stopped and looked at Jackson. Jackson left his team and walked straight up to Scrub. David held his breath. That's my dog, Jackson said accusingly. It's the coal you kicked out to starve, Fred said. The one with the broken leg, remember? Seems like it got all right. You working him now? Just giving him a little exercise. He's looking pretty good, bigger than any dog I got, even Keno. He wouldn't be alive if we hadn't cared for him. Jackson ignored the thrust. Can't never tell for sure how a pup'll turn out. I don't get surprised often, but this one fooled me. He turned to his team, stepped on the runners, and yielded. The whip snaked out and exploded like a rifle. He tore off a shower of snow, the whip cracking at regular intervals. Anytime you want lessons on how to run a team, Anytime you want lessons on how to ruin a team, Watch Smiley Jackson, Fred said disgustedly. He was surprised about Scrub, David said. He certainly was. Noble, let's go home. Winter's early dark closed down. The sled was unloaded and turned on its side against the cabin wall. The dogs were staked out and fed. During dinner, Fred filled Celia in on everything that had happened during their 6 days on the trail. "We put Scrub in harness, Mom," David said. "You should have seen him. He caught on real fast." "Naturally," Celia said. "Scrubby's a smart dog." "He had a couple of good teachers, Spot and Ginger," Fred smiled. They finished dinner, and David helped his mother clear the table and wash the dishes. Fred settled in a chair to read the Anchorage paper. Outside, Noble barked sharply and other dogs chimed in. Fred muttered, "Probably a rabbit." Then a knock came at the door. Fred opened the door and Smiley Jackson walked in. He scrubbed a hand across his perpetually grinning lips. He'd been drinking, but he was not drunk. He carried a short length of chain. His beady eyes darted about the room and spotted Scrub. "I come from a dog." Fred barred the way. "You don't just walk in here and start taking things," he said coldly. "Do, and it's my dog." "Who says he's your dog?" "Out of my bitch Goldie. That makes him my dog." "You cold him, kicked him out to starve or be killed. Still my dog, all square and legal." Smiley Jackson started forward again, and Fred put out a big hand and stopped him. "When I told you he was here, you couldn't be bothered to look at him. You said he never was any good, and with a broken leg he'd be worse. He's still the same dog." "You didn't say how good he looked," Jackson said. "He didn't look good then." "He does now." "You forfeited all rights to this dog when you threw him out." "Show me that in writing," Jackson challenged. "Everybody in Aurora knows he's mine." Celia said quickly, "Mr. Jackson, how much do you want for the dog? We'll buy him. He's David's pet now." "You don't say." Jackson's weasel eyes narrowed at the thought of money. "That dog's got the makings of a valuable animal. With his size and strength, he'll be a fine sled dog." "Maybe," Fred said. "Quit building it up, set a price." "Tell you what, give me $500 and your kid's got a pet." "Come off it," Fred said angrily. "That's the price of a well-trained sled dog." "Which he'll be when I get through with him." "500, Celia said, shocked. "Cash money." Jackson held out a grimy paw. "You're crazy." "Sure I am," Jackson said. 500 or I take him." The moment David saw Jackson in the open door, shock rolled through him, and he'd gone immediately to Scrub. Now he squatted on the floor, his arm around the dog, while the argument broke over him. Scrub was sitting up, his body tense at the sound of angry voices. Every time he heard Jackson's nasal twang, the edges of his lips curled. "The price for the average trained sled dog is $300, Fred said. "That's what I'll give you." "He won't be average," Jackson said. "I'll take my dog." "What are you going to do with him?" David asked fearfully. "None of your business, boy." "Dad," David said, "you're not going to let him have Scrub." "I'll split the difference with you," Fred said. 400. You'll be getting more than a trained dog. You'll be getting more than a trained dog price for one that's green and untried. Jackson shook his head. "I got a feeling he ain't so green and untried as you're saying." Celia said, very businesslike, "We'll give you 500, Mr. Jackson. Now then, we cared for Scrub, nursed him back to health, and have fed him for months. We'll subtract that from the 500 and pay you the difference." "I didn't give you authority to do a thing to that dog," Jackson said. "You did that on your own, so you're out whatever it cost you. But I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll make it $450. That's your last chance." "All right," Fred agreed, "but you'll have to wait until I can sell some fur." Jackson shook his head. $450, cash in hand now, tonight." "I don't have the cash, but you'll get your money." "No cash," Jackson said. "No dog." "You have no intention of selling him to us," Celia said angrily. Jackson's lips pulled into a gargoyle smile. He said to Fred, "Tell your kid to get away from my property." David saw his father's big fists knot. Muscles bunched along his lean jaws. Then he said quietly, "Dave, get away from Scrub." "No!" David said fiercely. "Not after all we've done. After he's lived with us. He can't." His father repeated, "Get away, Dave." "I won't. Scrub's not going back with him. Mom?" She shook her head. "Don't make it harder than it is." "Mom, we can't. It's not right." Her voice was sharp. Do as your father says, now. David looked at her snapping black eyes, at his father's stormy face. There was no help anywhere. He took his arm slowly from Scrub's neck and stood up. He didn't want to watch Jackson cross the room with that grin on his face and snap the chain around Scrub's neck, but he couldn't take his eyes away. Come on! Jackson jerked on the chain. Scrub turned his head and looked at David. Jackson yanked brutally, and Scrub lifted his lips. So, Jackson said, I gotta show you who's boss. Don't yank that chain again, Fred said sharply. I'll handle him my way. Not in this house. Now get hold of that chain and take him out right, Fred's voice was commanding, and do it now. Jackson looked at the big man, and his smirk disappeared. He took hold of the chain close to Scrub's neck, literally lifting the dog to his feet, and pulled him toward the door. Scrub braced his feet and twisted his head around. Searching for David, he began to whine. David started forward and was stopped by his father's sharp, Hold it, Dave! Then Fred blocked Jackson's way a last time. His eyes hit Jackson with so driving a look that the man could not meet it. If you ever come out here again for any reason at all, I'll stomp you out in sight of the ground. I'll stomp you out of sight of the ground. You remember that. Now get out. No reason to come back. I got my property. Jackson went out, dragging the struggling, whining Scrub. Fred closed the door and looked at his son. I'm sorry, Dave. The law was on his side, and it can be cold-blooded and brutal. David's throat was so full he couldn't speak. The room blurred. He didn't look at his mother. She was crying. He turned blindly into his room and slammed the door. A part of him had been cruelly torn away this night. Nothing would ever be the same again. And that's the end of chapter 5.